I'm leaving you, Alexander, and I'm taking the house. Those were the exact words my wife said as she stood in our living room, suitcase in hand, without a hint of guilt in her voice. After 5 years of marriage, this was how it ended. Cold, calculated, and cruel. But instead of breaking down, I looked her straight in the eye and replied calmly, "You might want to check the prenup you signed before packing too much." You see, Victoria thought she had it all figured out. She thought leaving me for her rich boss would be her golden ticket, and that our Beacon Hill townhouse would be part of her prize. What she didn't know was that the moment she betrayed me, she signed away everything I had learned the hard way, watching my own family fall apart decades ago. That trust without protection is a fool's game. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you love, stay with me. Because this is the story of how I turned heartbreak into the smartest decision I ever made. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge with Chris, where real stories of betrayal meet justice. What would you do if the person you trusted most tried to take everything from you? Let's begin. I wasn't always this guarded. There was a time when I believed in love without conditions, when I thought trust was enough to build a future. But life taught me early that even the people closest to you could destroy everything. I grew up in a wealthy household in Boston. My parents were the picture of success until they weren't. When I was 16, I watched my mother's affair tear our family apart. The divorce that followed didn't just break hearts, it shattered our finances. My father, blindsided and unprepared, lost everything: our home, his business, even his dignity. I swore to myself that I'd never let emotions cloud my judgment the way his did. Fast forward 20 years, I had built a solid career as a financial advisor. Every decision I made was calculated, cautious, and smart. And then I met Victoria. She was vibrant, charming, full of life. The kind of woman who could make a man forget every rule he'd ever set for himself. We met at a charity gala, and from that night on, everything moved fast. Dinners, weekend getaways, whispered promises about forever. For the first time, I let my guard down. I wanted to believe that not everyone was like my mother, but old scars don't fade easily. When I proposed to Victoria, I did something that surprised even myself. I asked her to sign a prenuptial agreement. It wasn't romantic, but it was necessary. There was one clause I insisted on: the infidelity clause. If either of us cheated, the guilty party would forfeit any claim to assets acquired during the marriage. Victoria laughed when she saw it. "I would never do that to you," she said, waving it off like it was a silly formality. She signed it without reading a single line. I should have known then, anyone who dismisses something that serious isn't thinking long-term, but love makes you ignore the small warnings. For 5 years, everything seemed perfect. We bought a beautiful townhouse in Beacon Hill, paid entirely with my pre-marriage savings. Victoria landed a job as an executive assistant to a high-profile CEO named Bradley, an older, wealthy man with a reputation I should have questioned sooner. At first, I was proud of her. She was ambitious, driven, always talking about how much she was learning. But slowly things began to shift. Late nights at the office became the norm. Weekend plans were too exhausting for her. The woman who once couldn't wait to share every detail of her day suddenly had nothing to say. I told myself it was just the pressures of work, that every marriage had its phases. But deep down, that old familiar feeling crept in, the one I hadn't felt since I was 16, standing in the hallway hearing my parents argue about betrayal. I didn't want to believe it. Not again. Not with her. But sometimes ignoring the truth only gives it more time to destroy you. It started with small things, details most people would overlook. Victoria changing her perfume to something I'd never smelled before. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always glued to her hand or face down, locked with a new passcode. When I asked how work was going, she'd give vague answers or snap that I was being too nosy. I wanted to trust her. God, I tried to trust her. But when you've lived through betrayal, once your instincts never really quiet down. And mine were screaming. One Friday night, she came home past midnight, claiming she'd been working late on a project with Bradley. Her hair was perfect makeup, still fresh, too fresh, for someone who'd supposedly spent hours buried in spreadsheets. I didn't say anything, I just watched. The next morning, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message preview from him. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait for our weekend getaway." My chest tightened. I stared at the screen, hoping I had read it wrong. But there it was, clear as day. That was the moment denial died. But I wasn't about to confront her without a plan. I'd seen what impulsive reactions did to my father. Rage and heartbreak didn't win battles, strategy did. So I called a private investigator, a professional I had referred clients to over the years when handling complex divorces. It felt surreal hiring someone to follow my own wife. Within a week, I had more than enough confirmation. Photos of Victoria and Bradley holding hands at upscale restaurants, checking into hotels under fake names, laughing like teenagers in love, 6 months. That's how long it had been going on behind my back in Bradley. He wasn't just some fling. He had promised Victoria he'd leave his wife and they'd start a new life together, funded no doubt by what she thought she'd get from me. I remember sitting alone in our living room flipping through the investigator's report. Every picture felt like a punch to the gut, but beneath the hurt there was clarity. Victoria wasn't just betraying me emotionally. She was making plans to take everything she could. A few days later, she made her move. She walked through the door with a rehearsed calm, sat me down and said the words she probably thought would crush me. "I'm leaving you, Alexander Bradley and I. We're serious. I expect the townhouse and my fair share of your assets. Let's not make this messy." I looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't the woman I married. This was someone who saw me as a stepping stone. A means to an end. I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but instead I nodded and simply said, "Of course, as long as we follow what we both agreed to." She frowned clearly, confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked. That's when I mentioned the prenup. Her face shifted, first disbelief, then annoyance. "Oh, that it's meaningless. My lawyer says those things never hold up." I didn't argue. I just told her I'd let my attorney handle everything, and that she should probably have hers actually read the document this time. She rolled her eyes, acting like she was still in control. But deep down, I knew the game had already changed. She just didn't realize she'd already lost. It didn't take long for Victoria's confidence to crack. A week after she moved out, I received an email from her lawyer full of demands. She wanted the townhouse alimony, a share of my investment portfolio, even my car. It was almost impressive how bold she was, considering the circumstances, but I stayed silent. I forwarded everything to my attorney along with the prenup and the thick folder of evidence from the private investigator. A few days later, Victoria called me directly, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "What game are you playing, Alexander?" she snapped. "My lawyer says you're refusing to negotiate." I kept my tone calm. "I'm not refusing anything, Victoria. I'm honoring exactly what we agreed to 5 years ago." There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear her scrambling to remember. "That prenup is worthless?" she finally said, her voice laced with frustration. "You think some piece of paper is going to stop me from getting what I deserve?" That was the moment I realized she truly had no idea what she'd signed. For Victoria, the prenup had always been a joke, something she thought I'd never enforced because in her mind I was too decent to do so. But decency doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you. A week later, her attorney requested a meeting, a last-ditch effort to intimidate me, I assumed. When we sat down across the table, he looked smug until my lawyer slid the folder across to him. Inside was everything: the signed prenup, the infidelity clause highlighted in bold and undeniable proof of her affair. As he flipped through the pages, I watched his expression shift from cocky to concerned, and finally to defeated. Victoria sat beside him, arms crossed, trying to maintain her composure. When her lawyer leaned over and whispered something in her ear, her face went pale. She glanced at me, eyes wide, not with guilt but with panic. This isn't enforceable," she stammered, looking for any loophole. My attorney smiled politely. "Actually, it is. It's airtight, and with the evidence we have, your client has no legal claim to Mr. Morgan's assets or the property." Victoria's voice cracked. "So what, I get nothing after 5 years? I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply said, you made your choice. Victoria, actions have consequences. That was it. No dramatic outburst. No second chances. She left that meeting in silence. No townhouse, no settlement, no fallback plan. And that's when it hit me. The true point of no return wasn't when she cheated. It wasn't even when she walked out the door. It was when she underestimated me, thinking I'd be too blinded by emotion to protect myself. I stood outside the law office that day watching her disappear down the street. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. Not because I'd won, but because I refused to be a victim of someone else's greed. Victoria had gambled everything on a fantasy with Bradley, and now reality was about to hit her harder than she ever expected. As for me, I walked back to my Beacon Hill townhouse alone, but with my dignity, my assets, and my future still intact. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to rub it in, to throw the prenup in Victoria's face replay, every photo the investigator took, and watch her squirm. But revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's letting someone walk straight into the consequences they created and saying nothing as the door quietly shuts behind them. After that meeting with the lawyers, I didn't hear from Victoria for a while. No texts, no calls, just silence. But I wasn't waiting around. I was moving forward. I met with my attorney again and began formal proceedings to finalize the divorce as quickly and cleanly as possible. There was nothing left to negotiate legally or emotionally. And to make sure everything was buttoned up, I updated my estate plan, locked down all account access, and even switched financial firms to avoid any backdoor attempts on my records. Victoria may have underestimated me once, but she wouldn't get a second chance. I also called the private investigator. This time not for myself, I offered to put him on retainer for my practice. You see, something changed in me during that process. For years, I'd advised couples on retirement savings and investment strategies. But this experience opened my eyes to a whole other side of financial planning, one most people ignore until it's too late at protection during marriage. So I pivoted. Quietly, I started offering confidential prenup consultations, helped clients evaluate asset vulnerability before they tied the knot, and built a new branch in my firm focused on divorce financial strategy. It wasn't flashy work, but it was real. And the people I helped, they weren't gold diggers or cold-hearted planners. They were everyday folks who'd been burned once and refused to be burned again. Meanwhile, words started trickling in about Victoria. Apparently, things weren't going quite as she imagined. Bradley, her knight in shining armor, hadn't left his wife. In fact, after our divorce became public record and she walked away with nothing, he began ghosting her. Her name never made it into the country club gossip columns. There was no fairy tale ending. No luxurious condo in the Seaport District. Last I heard, she was renting a one-bedroom in Somerville and working at a smaller firm that didn't even have health benefits. I didn't gloat when I heard that. I didn't even feel triumphant. What I felt was clarity. She hadn't just lost a marriage. She'd lost herself chasing something that was never real. Bradley didn't love her. He used her. And when she had no financial leverage left, she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. As for me, I went back to the townhouse, the one she tried to claim, and repainted the walls. Literally, I had every trace of her removed. The framed photos, the scent she left behind, even the throw pillows she insisted on. Gone, I turned that place into a reflection of me again, of the man I had become, not bitter, not broken, but sharper, calmer, and much, much wiser. Eventually, something unexpected happened. A colleague, Melissa, joined our firm's planning team. She had gone through a rough divorce of her own and understood the toll it took, not just emotionally, but financially. We started talking first about spreadsheets and interest rates, then about life. And over time, something grew between us. Not fast, not flashy, but honest. And that made all the difference. I'll never forget the last time I saw Victoria. It was late afternoon, a gray February sky hanging low over the city. I was grabbing coffee downtown, heading back to a meeting, when I heard someone call my name, soft, hesitant. I turned around, and there she was, standing near the crosswalk, bundled in a cheap coat, hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired. Not the radiant, confident woman I had once married, just tired. "Alexander," she said again, a little louder now. "Can we talk?" I hesitated but nodded. We walked a few blocks in silence before she finally spoke. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said quietly. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know her comfort, but I owed myself closure. "You didn't think it would end at all?" I said. She looked down, her hands buried in her coat pockets. "I made a mistake." There it was. Not a full apology, but the closest I would ever get. She admitted Bradley had strung her along, that he never planned to leave his wife. That once the prenup kicked in and she got nothing, his calls stopped. She said she'd had to sell her car, downsize, her life start over. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt sorry for her. Not because I missed her, not because I wanted her back, but because I finally saw her for what she truly was. Not some master manipulator, but a person who thought she could cheat the system only to realize the system had already been built to protect itself. I told her I hope she found peace. That was all, no bitterness, no gloating. Then I turned and walked away. That was the true climax, not the prenup being enforced, not the legal victory. This was it, facing the person who once betrayed me, and realizing they no longer had any power over my life. Victoria faded into the background after that. She moved apartments again, dropped off social media, and stopped showing up to mutual events. She wasn't invited anymore. Her fall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, quiet, like a balloon losing air one breath at a time. And the fallout, it wasn't hers alone. Bradley's wife eventually found out, probably through office whispers or a private investigator of her own. Their marriage hit the rocks, but they didn't split. From what I heard, he recommitted to her after distancing himself from the scandal. Typical Victoria had been disposable the whole time. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding something stronger than I'd ever imagined. Business was thriving. Clients trusted me not just because of my expertise, but because I understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to be blindsided. My story wasn't just some cautionary tale. It became a tool. And Melissa, she never rushed me. She never pushed past boundaries. She understood the value of quiet, of space, of letting trust grow slowly without pressure. A year later, we hosted a small dinner with close friends. No fanfare, no fancy photos, just good food, laughter, and honesty. That night, as I stood on our patio looking out over the city skyline, I realized something. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the legal chaos, it hadn't broken me, it refined me. And sometimes, losing someone who didn't value you is the greatest win of all. Looking back, now I don't see my story as one of betrayal. I see it as a lesson, one I had been prepared for my entire life, even if I didn't know it at the time. When my parents' marriage collapsed, I promised myself I'd never let emotions blind me the way they blinded my father. But I also promised I wouldn't let fear stop me from loving someone. Finding that balance, that's the real challenge. It's easy to think that protecting yourself means you don't trust people. But the truth is, real trust comes after you've put safeguards in place. Because love isn't about ignoring risk. It's about being honest with yourself and with the person you're building a future with. Victoria taught me that not everyone who says forever means it. And that's okay. Some people come into your life to remind you of the value of caution and the price of ignoring it. Today, I help others avoid the mistakes I almost made. I sit across from couples or individuals about to get married and I tell them what no one told me. Protecting your assets doesn't mean you're planning for failure. It means you respect yourself enough to prepare for whatever life throws at you. Melissa and I, we did things differently. When we decided to commit, we sat down like business partners because love and partnership aren't mutually exclusive. We were transparent about finances, expectations, and yes, we signed agreements. Not because we didn't trust each other, but because we did. That's the kind of love I wish more people understood. One built on honesty, not illusions. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Trust with your heart, but protect with your mind. Because at the end of the day, it's not about expecting betrayal. It's about ensuring that if someone ever does betray you, you'll walk away with more than just lessons. You'll walk away with your future still intact.